As I walked past Ethan's bedroom, a faint sound reached my ears. It was quiet, almost drowned out by the silence of the house, but distinct enough to make me stop. A soft groan slipped through the partially closed door, stirring a wave of concern before I even had time to think. Instinctively, I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The sight inside made me freeze. Ethan was stretched across his bed, his shirt discarded somewhere out of sight. A thin sheen of sweat reflected the afternoon light pouring through the curtains. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate rhythm. One hand clenched the edge of the blanket, while the other disappeared beneath it. His eyes remained closed for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. Every instinct told me I should step back, quietly close the door, and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I remained rooted where I stood. I couldn't explain why I didn't leave. It wasn't curiosity alone. It was something deeper, something confusing that settled heavily in my chest and refused to let me move. Then his eyes opened. They met mine instantly. For several long seconds, the room remained perfectly silent. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us looked away. A slow smile appeared on his face. "I didn't mean to interrupt," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He offered no reply. He didn't have to. Without fully understanding why, I found myself stepping farther into the room. Every movement felt strangely disconnected from reason, as though someone else had taken control while I watched from a distance. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs with every step until I reached the edge of the bed. Slowly, I sat down. My hands trembled in my lap. Ethan simply watched me. There was something unsettling about his stare. Calm, patient, unwavering. The silence between us seemed heavier than words ever could have been. It felt as though an invisible boundary stood between us, one neither of us should have crossed. When I finally left the room later that day, I barely recognized the person walking down the hallway. The house was silent, yet everything around me felt unbearably loud. I avoided every reflective surface until I reached the bathroom, where I locked the door behind me. Turning on the faucet, I stared at the stream of water rushing into the sink, wishing it could somehow wash away the crushing weight pressing against my conscience. It couldn't. Sleep never truly came that night. Morning arrived far too quickly. Golden sunlight poured through the bedroom window as though the world had decided nothing was different, while inside me everything felt fractured. I stayed beneath the blankets much longer than usual, hoping that delaying the day might somehow delay reality itself. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. After showering, I pulled on a loose sweater, slipped into a pair of jeans, and gathered my hair into a messy bun. Standing before the mirror, I rehearsed the same lie over and over. Nothing happened. Everything is normal. You can get through today. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, those fragile thoughts shattered. Ethan stood at the counter eating breakfast, as though it were any ordinary morning. Fresh from the shower, his damp hair fell carelessly across his forehead. He glanced toward me and offered an easy smile. "Morning, Melissa." I answered with something little more than a quiet mumble before making my way toward the refrigerator. My hands shook slightly as I reached inside. "You seem different today," he remarked casually. The refrigerator door closed with more force than I intended. "Just eat your breakfast," I replied, sharper than I meant. A quiet laugh escaped him. I focused on cracking eggs into a pan, watching them sizzle as if concentrating hard enough could drown out everything else around me. It didn't. I sensed a move closer. Not close enough to touch. Just close enough that I became painfully aware of his presence. "You don't have to pretend," he said quietly. I stopped moving. "I know you're trying." The spatula slipped from my fingers and clattered against the floor. "Please," I said softly. "Don't." I turned toward him, determined to draw a line that should never have been crossed. Yet the moment our eyes met, I realized I wasn't looking at someone burdened by regret. His expression remained unreadable. Calm. Certain. That certainty unsettled me more than anger ever could have. I took a slow step backward, creating distance between us. "We can't keep acting like this," I said. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I turned away, ending the conversation before it could become something I would regret even more. That evening, David returned home. The moment he walked through the front door, he wrapped me in a warm embrace, smiling exactly as he always had. I hugged him back, but my body remained tense. Everything inside me had changed, even if he couldn't possibly know it. Over his shoulder, I noticed Ethan standing quietly near the staircase. His face revealed almost nothing. Dinner became an exhausting performance. David happily talked about his trip, sharing stories and laughing about small inconveniences he had faced while traveling. I smiled when expected, nodded in the right places, and answered every question as naturally as I could manage. Inside, however, my thoughts never settled. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Every smile felt borrowed. Later, after dinner, David headed upstairs to shower. The silence returned. I stood alone in the hallway, taking slow breaths, trying to steady myself. When I looked up, Ethan was standing several feet away. He said nothing. He simply looked at me. There were no accusations, no explanations, only silence filled with things neither of us dared to say aloud. Unable to bear another second of it, I brushed past him and hurried into the bathroom, locking the door behind me once again. I faced the mirror. The reflection staring back no longer felt familiar. "What have I done?" I whispered. The question echoed in the empty room. 4 days passed after David came home. 4 days of carefully constructed normalcy. 4 days of breakfast conversations, shared dinners, ordinary routines, and forced laughter. Every day I played the role expected of me. Every day the performance became harder. I smiled when people looked. I laughed when conversations demanded it. I kept my voice calm even when anxiety tightened around every word. Ethan became both impossible to ignore and impossible to confront. He was everywhere without truly being present. Sometimes he barely spoke. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Yet somehow his quiet presence lingered in every room we shared. Whenever I entered a space, I found him there sooner or later. He never pressured me. He never forced another conversation. But every glance carried questions I wasn't prepared to answer. And with each passing day, the silence between us became heavier than any words either of us could have spoken. His presence lingered around me like a shadow I could never quite escape. No matter how hard I tried to move on, it remained a constant reminder of the moment that had changed everything. I told myself over and over that I needed distance, that the only way forward was to avoid him completely. So, I did everything I could. I stopped lingering in shared spaces whenever he was around. If I heard him downstairs, I'd find a reason to stay upstairs. I spent extra time tending the garden, letting the afternoon sun distract me from my thoughts. Grocery trips that once took 20 minutes suddenly stretched into an hour. I even enrolled in a neighborhood yoga class, grateful for any excuse to spend less time inside the house. None of it worked. No matter how carefully I rebuilt my routine, Ethan always seemed to find a way into it. One quiet afternoon, I sat in the living room folding freshly washed laundry. The repetitive motion helped settle my racing thoughts, and for a little while I almost convinced myself everything was returning to normal. Then I heard footsteps. Ethan entered the room without a word. Instead of speaking, he settled onto the arm of the couch and simply watched me. I refused to meet his eyes, keeping my attention fixed on neatly folding towels and stacking shirts into perfect piles. After several moments of silence, he finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend around me." My hands stopped moving. "Pretend about what?" I asked without looking up. He answered calmly. "That nothing happened." The words settled heavily between us. "That you don't think about it." Slowly, I lifted my gaze. There it was again, that quiet certainty that unsettled me every time. He looked at me as though every thought I tried to hide was written plainly across my face. "I'm not doing this," I said, standing and clutching a folded towel against my chest. "This conversation is over." "I'm not trying to argue," he replied, raising one hand slightly in a gesture meant to reassure me. "I just think you're afraid of what you felt." I stared at him. My jaw tightened. "I'm married to your father." "I know." His voice softened. "And I'm not trying to destroy your life. but pretending that moment never existed won't make it disappear. He paused before continuing. You felt something. So did I. I bent down, picked up the laundry basket, and held it tightly. It was a mistake, I said firmly. And it isn't happening again. I turned toward the hallway. Just before I disappeared around the corner, I heard him speak once more. You don't sound convinced. I didn't answer. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake beside David, staring into the darkness, while the slow ticking of the bedroom clock filled the silence. His breathing was steady, peaceful, completely unaware of the storm inside my mind. I hated myself for wondering what Ethan might be thinking. I hated myself even more for wondering whether he was awake, wrestling with the same memories. The thoughts wouldn't leave. Then my phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. A message. My pulse quickened before I even looked. It was from Ethan. Can't sleep either? I stared at the words for several seconds before locking the screen without replying. Turning the phone face down, I rolled onto my side and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping exhaustion would eventually win. A few days later, I found myself preparing dinner in the kitchen. Fresh air drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of newly cut grass. Upstairs, David was occupied with another work call, his voice faintly echoing through the ceiling. It was one of the rare weekdays he happened to be home. Ethan wandered into the kitchen wearing athletic shorts and a gray t-shirt. He grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator before leaning casually against the counter. He watched me slice vegetables for a moment. You're awfully quiet today. I continued cutting without answering. After another pause, he spoke again. I've been thinking. I sighed and carefully set the knife aside. Ethan. He lifted a hand. Just hear me out. Reluctantly, I crossed my arms and faced him. I know what happened or almost happened was wrong, he said evenly. I'm not proud of it. He hesitated. But I can't pretend it meant nothing. A knot formed in my chest. This isn't some game. I know. I'm serious. His expression remained calm. It made me realize things I hadn't admitted to myself before. Silence settled between us. Finally, he continued. Why are you pretending you're happy? The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came. You go through every day acting like everything's fine, he said quietly. But I notice the little things. His eyes never left mine. I see you staring out the window while Dad spends another evening buried in work. I notice how tense you become whenever we're in the same room. I see far more than you think. I lowered my gaze. Some part of me wanted to dismiss every word. Another part recognized uncomfortable truths hidden inside them. I'm not trying to ruin your marriage, he continued. I'm only saying you deserve to be honest with yourself. I stepped backward, creating space between us. You don't know my life. Maybe not all of it. His reply came gently. But I know I've never seen you seem as alive as you did that night. My throat tightened. Stop. He remained where he stood. I'm not going to pressure you. His voice stayed steady. I won't cross any boundaries. He paused before adding one final thought. I just needed you to know that whatever happened affected me too. The sincerity in his words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I need to finish dinner, I said quietly, turning back toward the counter. For once, he didn't argue. A moment later, I heard his footsteps disappear down the hallway. That evening, I sat across from David at the dinner table, absent-mindedly moving food around my plate. He glanced up from his phone. Everything okay? I forced a tired smile. I'm just exhausted. He nodded sympathetically. You've been carrying a lot lately. Maybe we should get away for a weekend. Just the two of us. That sounds nice, I replied. The words left my mouth easily. Believing them was another matter entirely. Somewhere along the way, it felt as though David no longer truly saw me. Maybe he never had. And I couldn't remember the last time I had felt completely understood by anyone. The following Sunday, David left once again for another business conference, and the house settled into an uneasy silence that felt far louder than it should have. I spent the day trying to keep myself occupied. Every room in the house seemed to hold a memory I wanted to avoid, so I threw myself into chores that had long been neglected. I dusted shelves, organized closets, wiped down kitchen counters twice, and folded laundry that didn't really need folding. Anything to keep my thoughts from wandering. As evenings settled over the neighborhood, I carried the watering can into the backyard. The fading sunlight painted the garden in warm shades of gold and amber, and for a few quiet minutes, I focused entirely on the flowers, letting the familiar routine calm my restless mind. Only then did I notice Ethan sitting on the porch steps. A pair of headphones rested over his ears, and a small sketchbook lay open across his knees. His pencil moved steadily across the page, his attention completely absorbed. I hadn't realized he enjoyed drawing. For a moment, I simply watched from a distance before turning my attention back to the flower beds. Eventually, he noticed me and pulled one earbud free. "Hey." "Hi," I replied, continuing to water the hydrangeas. "I didn't know you spent this much time out here. It helps clear my head." He nodded thoughtfully before standing and walking toward me. "I wanted to show you something." I hesitated before giving a small nod. He handed me the sketchbook. The pages were filled with careful pencil drawings, rolling hills, quiet streets, old buildings, and trees swaying in the wind. There were a few portraits too, each surprisingly detailed. Then I reached the final page. It was a drawing of a woman standing beside a window, her hair tied back, her shoulders slightly slumped as she stared into the distance. I recognized myself immediately. "I drew it a few nights ago," he said quietly. "You looked like you had the weight of the world on your shoulders." I studied the drawing for several long moments. The attention to detail surprised me. It wasn't simply a portrait. It captured exhaustion, loneliness, the quiet sadness I had tried so hard to hide. "It's very well done," I said softly before closing the notebook and handing it back. "I should probably head inside." He accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you for looking." Without another word, I walked back toward the house. That evening I sat beside the bedroom window, my knees pulled close as moonlight spilled across the floor. My thoughts kept returning to the sketch. Not because of the drawing itself, but because someone had noticed what I had spent months pretending wasn't there. I should have felt relieved that someone understood. Instead, I felt unsettled. The next morning began much like every other. David sat at the breakfast table with a mug of black coffee in one hand and his tablet in the other, scanning through emails before work. His tie hung slightly crooked around his neck, and his hair was still damp from the shower. I placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "Thanks, Han," he said without looking away from the screen. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, watching steam curl into the air. "How's work?" "Busy," he answered. "There's a chance they'll send me to Denver next week. Maybe 3 days. Maybe longer." "I understand. You okay with that?" I looked up. "I'm used to it." The words came out more honestly than I intended. He looked at me for a second before returning to his emails. Neither of us spoke after that. Later that morning I stood before the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair into a loose ponytail. Dark circles framed my eyes. My reflection looked tired. Older somehow. Not because of age, but because carrying unspoken thoughts had become exhausting. Ethan had kept his distance since our conversation in the backyard. He hadn't tried to start another discussion. He hadn't interrupted my routines. Oddly enough, the silence felt heavier than the conversations had. When I went downstairs, I found a note on the kitchen counter. At the gym, I looked at the familiar handwriting before quietly setting the note aside. I wasn't sure why something so small affected me. That afternoon, I drove to the local library. The peaceful silence between rows of books felt comforting in a way the house no longer did. I settled into a quiet corner with a familiar novel, hoping to lose myself in someone else's story for a while. Hours passed unnoticed. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a young couple laughing together near the entrance. Their conversation seemed effortless. Their happiness looked uncomplicated. For a brief moment, I remembered when David and I had shared that same ease with one another. Or perhaps I only remembered believing we did. When I arrived home, the house remained quiet. David was still at work. Ethan's bedroom door was closed. I unpacked groceries, started another load of laundry, and began preparing dinner. Inside the refrigerator sat a container of leftovers with a handwritten note attached. Thought you might forget lunch again. I stared at it before removing the note and setting it aside. Eventually, I warmed the food anyway. That evening, David arrived home, looking completely drained. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek before loosening his tie. Long day. The longest. My boss won't stop talking about the Denver presentation. Dinner's in the oven. He smiled. Thank you. Later we sat together in the living room. The television played quietly in the background while David scrolled through his phone. After several minutes of silence, I finally spoke. Do you ever feel like we've become roommates? He looked up immediately. What do you mean? We eat together. We sleep in the same house. But sometimes it feels like we're simply moving through the same routines instead of really living together. He sat quietly for a moment. I didn't realize you felt that way. I wasn't sure how to explain it. He reached over and gently took my hand. I'm sorry. I've been so focused on work that I haven't paid enough attention to us. I'll try to do better. I smiled faintly. I'd like that. The next afternoon, the weather was unusually calm. I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. Rows of maple trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves beginning to change into brilliant shades of orange and red. Porches were decorated for autumn with pumpkins, potted chrysanthemums, and wind chimes that barely stirred in the still air. Eventually, I reached the neighborhood park. Children laughed as they raced across the playground while parents watched from nearby benches. Seeing them brought back memories of conversations David and I once had about starting a family. We had always believed there would be more time. Then months quietly became years. The dream slowly faded without either of us acknowledging it. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Mind if I sit? I turned to see Ethan standing a respectful distance away. I nodded. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Instead, we watched the children playing beneath the afternoon sun. Finally, he broke the silence. I wasn't sure if I should say hello. I needed some space, I admitted. He nodded in understanding. I figured. The conversation ended there, leaving both of us quietly watching the world continue around us while each wrestled with thoughts neither was ready to put into words. I've been trying to understand what's happening to me, I admitted quietly. Ethan looked at me for a long moment before answering. There's nothing wrong with you. I let out a tired laugh that carried no humor. I've spent weeks questioning every decision I've made. You've been carrying too much on your own, he replied. Anyone would struggle. I shook my head. I don't even recognize myself anymore. His expression softened. I think you've forgotten who you were long before any of this started. The words settled heavily between us. I've been living on autopilot, I whispered. Every day feels exactly the same. I wake up, clean the house, make dinner, smile when I'm supposed to, and somehow convince myself that's enough. It doesn't have to stay that way. I looked toward the playground where children laughed without a care in the world. I've built my whole life around taking care of everyone else. And who's been taking care of you? I didn't have an answer. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I stood. I should head home. I'll walk with you, he offered. I hesitated before nodding. The walk back was almost entirely silent. The neighborhood was peaceful, leaves drifting lazily across the sidewalks as a cool breeze carried the first hints of autumn. When we reached the front door, we stopped. Thank you, I said. For what? For listening. He smiled gently. Sometimes that's enough. I returned the smile before stepping inside. The house felt strangely cold the following morning, not because the weather had changed, but because something inside me finally had. David had already left for an early meeting. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, half full and already growing cold. I stared at it for a long time. How many mornings had we shared the same room without really sharing our lives? How long had silence replaced conversation? I wandered slowly through the house. Without television or music playing, every room seemed unnaturally quiet. Eventually, I found myself sitting in the unused guest room. Dust floated through the sunlight as I looked around the tidy space. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to stop pretending everything was fine. The loneliness hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown slowly over years. Routine had quietly replaced connection. Responsibilities had replaced dreams. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking myself whether I was happy. Instead, I had focused entirely on getting through each day. That realization hurt more than I expected. The real problem wasn't one conversation or one difficult season. It was that I had allowed my own identity to disappear beneath years of obligation and habit. By the afternoon, I heard Ethan return home. The sounds of grocery bags being unpacked drifted upstairs. He didn't call out. He didn't come looking for me. I appreciated the distance. It gave me room to think. As evening settled in, I stepped outside. He was sitting on the back porch again, wearing a hoodie despite the mild weather. He looked up when I approached, but remained quiet. I sat beside him. After a long silence, I finally spoke. "I'm leaving for a few days." He turned toward me. "Where?" "I rented a small cabin for a week." "A vacation?" "More like a reset." He nodded thoughtfully. "Does Dad know?" "Not yet." The answer hung in the air between us. I need time to figure out who I am outside of this house. He understood, without asking more questions. "I'm sorry for everything these last few weeks," I said. "I think we've all been trying to make sense of things. I should have dealt with my problems much sooner." We all avoid difficult conversations sometimes. His response carried no judgment, only understanding. I looked out across the backyard where the evening light stretched long shadows across the grass. "You reminded me that I'd stopped paying attention to my own life," I admitted. "I don't want to keep waiting for happiness to happen on its own." He smiled. "Then don't." We sat quietly until the first crickets began singing. When I finally stood, I rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Take care of yourself." "You too." That night, I packed a small suitcase. Before leaving, I wrote a note for David and placed it on the kitchen counter. "David, we've both been living on routine for longer than either of us realized. I need a few days away, not to run from our marriage, but to understand myself and what I need moving forward. I hope when I come back, we can have the honest conversations we've been avoiding for far too long. Please don't worry. I'll call tomorrow. Love, Melissa." As I zipped the suitcase closed, I realized I still didn't know what the future would look like. Maybe David and I could rebuild what we'd neglected. Maybe we couldn't. Either way, I finally understood something that had taken years to admit. I couldn't keep waiting for my life to change while doing nothing to change it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running toward another person. I was finally taking the first uncertain steps toward rediscovering myself.